OK, next part, programming practices. There are two ways of constructing a software design. One way is to make it so simple that there are obviously no deficiencies, and the other way is to make it so complicated that there are no obvious deficiencies. So this is the guy who created Quicksort, one of those algorithms that I know nothing about. Really great quote, right? Because those are pretty much the two extremes of programming. Either you can figure it out or you can't figure it out. And when you can't figure it out, it's magic, it's OK. And when you can figure it out, you feel like you know something. And so programming practices are things that help you keep things simple. Right? So on the front end, I'd like to talk about things in terms of layers. We have the HTML, which is your data or your structure. And then on top of that, you layer styling, which is your CSS, and behavior, which is your JavaScript. Now, these are actually three very different worlds that interact with one another. And that's why I organize them like this, because both CSS and JavaScript pretty much rely on the HTML to do their jobs. CSS and JavaScript are kind of siblings in this stack that both work with the HTML. It's a very important lesson to keep in mind with this is you try to keep those as separate as possible. Right? Don't cross the streams. When you keep things separate, life becomes a lot easier. So keep your JavaScript out of HTML. Right? You never want to have inline event handlers like this. Really, really bad idea. Why? Because let's say you want to change the name of that method. You need to go and change it in your JavaScript. And then you need to go grep through the code base to find all of the other places that it's being used. Complete waste of time. Second, what if that click now needs to do two things instead of just one? How do you track that down? Ideally, you go into your JavaScript and you tell it what it should do now. In reality, you go to your HTML and start hacking around in that. Not good. And when you have a JavaScript problem or a JavaScript change, you want to go to the JavaScript to make that change. Sounds simple, right?
I was wondering what your thought is on something like Angularjs that really seems to merge the two.
So Angular also bootstrapped does a little bit of this, where they're going more for a declarative syntax. So it's not necessarily directly tying JavaScript functions to the HTML, but it is proclaiming this section of the HTML has a named behavior. And that named behavior maps to something in the JavaScript. But you're not directly calling it. You're just giving it hints as to what it should be doing. That, I think, is OK. And that we do all over the place. Everybody does, whether it's by using CSS classes to indicate this is how it should work, or by adding a data attribute somewhere. That's OK. You just don't want this tight coupling of I'm executing JavaScript code in HTML. So what else? On the other hand, you want to keep HTML out of JavaScript. Right? Same deal. If you have an HTML problem, you want to go and look at your templates to fix it. You don't want to go and look at your templates and then go, oh, crap, it's not here. Where do I go? Oh, well, you go in your JavaScript. Well, that makes no sense. Because I know that there was a markup problem. Why am I going into my JavaScript to fix the markup problem? No, you want to go into your templates to fix the markup problem, not your JavaScript. So really bad idea to have HTML strings embedded in your JavaScript. Keep JavaScript out of CSS. So Internet Explorer used to have this really awesome, horrible feature called CSS expressions that looks like this. This is actually JavaScript running inside of CSS. It was fortunately removed. I think IE9 removed it finally. But still alive and well in other ones. And I'm going to tell you a story about this, because I learned about this the hard way. One of my jobs several years ago, and not to put a date on it, but let's just say we were IE6 Firefox 1, around there. I got a bug, JavaScript error on the page. OK, so I started out at the beginning of the day and started debugging and couldn't quite figure it out. Now keep in mind, IE6 Firefox 1, not a lot of really great debugging tools at that point in time. Your best debugging tool was your brain. at that point. So I did what everybody was doing at that point in time. You go into JavaScript and just start putting alerts everywhere. Alert, like made it here, I'm here now, I'm here now. Great. So follow all the way through, couldn't find JavaScript error. So I did the next best debugging tool that we had, and I started commenting out chunks of code. And I spent the entire day meticulously commenting out function after function after function after function. And finally got to the point, no joke, I had commented out all of the JavaScript, and there was still a JavaScript error. And at that point, I thought to myself, I am going crazy. This should not be happening. Like, it technically should not be possible. And I still, to this day, do not know what, at 5 o'clock at night, made me stop and think to go and look at the CSS. But that's where I found an expression that was causing an error. So that was an entire day that I will never get back because of CSS expressions. Don't do it. Keep CSS out of JavaScript. So when you see a lot of stuff like this, style.color equals red, all that stuff, similar type of problem. Right? When you have a styling problem, you want to go to your CSS to solve that problem. You don't want to go into your JavaScript, because that's not naturally the place that you would think to go. Right? Keep all of the styling information in the CSS files. You can use CSS classes in your JavaScript, right? Add, remove them. Like, that's fine, because you can still go and change how those classes are being represented in your CSS. But don't put the actual CSS, color is red in your JavaScript. It just makes it a huge pain to maintain later. Go ahead.
What determines when you should make a new CSS rule? Like, if I have one styling that I need to do for a certain element, do I make a new rule for that, or do I do that as a one-off thing?
So the question was, when do you create a new rule? It's a good question, and the answer is it depends on the situation. It depends how you're using the class, and it depends what else you have in the system as well. So if you already have some classes that are, let's just say that you have an error class that turns text red, because all errors must be red by law. And all you need to do is add that class onto some text. But then somebody comes along and says, well, in addition to that, it should also be bold. Right? That's usually a situation where I stop and say, OK, why is this unique? Does it have to be unique? Do I actually need a new style? Can this be styled the same way as everything else? Can everything else be styled the same way as this? And failing those questions, then I may create a new class that is just for that. But I say it's hard to answer in kind of a generic way because it's so situation dependent.
I found the issue a lot with our spacings. Like, we have some defined medium padding, large padding, small
right.
padding. But there were some cases where pixels were off, and so in that case.
Yeah. So when you have a situation where pixels are off, the fact that you're looking to CSS to fix it probably means that there's some other error that was going on that was causing that, like some other interaction, which is why I'm just not so quick to add new classes all the time. Cool. This is one of my favorite ones. When you have an event handler, it should only handle events. So what does that mean? Well, this event handler is doing a hell of a lot more than handling an event. So it's creating a new div, and then it's aligning that div, and then it's showing a div. Right? All of that is happening within handle click. So that is not the best way to do things. This is a little bit better. What I've done is I've separated out the application logic from the event handling. And so show popup is now the method that's responsible for showing the popup. And then handle click is calling show popup. So that's better, because now the event handler doesn't contain any application logic. The problem is that we're still passing the event object around. This is one of my big issues with a lot of JavaScript that I see, is passing the event object around. So the event object is this painful object to deal with because it has somewhere in the realm of 100 properties on it. So when you're passing the event object into a method, it's hard for you to know what that method is expecting to be there because there are so many properties. There's all kinds of client X, client Y, screen X, screen Y, page X, all that stuff. Target, related target, prevent default. It can go on and on and on. And then browsers add like their own custom stuff as well. Tons of stuff on the event object makes your methods very opaque. As an added bonus, there is actually a lifecycle for event objects where you can, Voss learned about this the hard way, where the event object, after a certain period of time, disappears. It literally disappears because you've changed the way that code is flowing, and that object gets destroyed. It gets garbage collected very, very quickly. So passing the event object around, not great. This is much better. So we have handle click. That is literally just handling the click. Right, click goes to there. Calls show popup. Show popup has been refactored, so it accepts two arguments, X and Y. And so show popup gets passed event.clientX and event.clientY. So I'm no longer passing the event object around. Added bonus, much easier to test. You don't have to go through a click handler in order to test that function anymore. So don't pass event objects around. Keep event handlers just handling events. Don't modify objects you don't own. So this is something that JavaScripters have a lot of trouble with. Because JavaScript is so dynamic, I think at any point in time, you're like, oh, I need a method on that object. I'm just going to add it. Nobody's going to stop me. It's fine. So I'm going to add this oh yeah method onto every array just because I think it's cool. And then for YUI, I'm going to override use, which if you're unfamiliar with YUI, is the single most important method. There's nothing preventing you from overwriting that in JavaScript. It's pretty much free reign. You can do whatever you want to whatever object you have, which is awesome and horrible at the same time. So being a little bit careful about what objects you modify is incredibly important in a team environment. Why? Because everybody who is working on that code expects the environment to behave a certain way. They expect the objects that they know to work in the way that they are familiar with. So there's also another one that I was personally bitten by. This one happened when I was working at Yahoo. So with YUI2, there was a method called stop event. And that would cancel the default behavior of a click, and that would stop propagation of the event. And so we got a bug file. Great. Go in. Somebody had, we figured this out after about 3 hours, somebody had overwritten stop event to do something else. Part of that something else involved adding a new event handler someplace else. So every place in the code that was using stop event was now creating an additional event handler someplace else. And it took 3 people an entire day, I was one of them, to sift through this and finally fix the error. And it took us that long because you assume that stop event was going to work the way that it's defined to work. But yet it wasn't. So you don't even stop and think to go into that. And that's the problem with modifying objects you don't own. People have assumptions about how it works. And when you change that, it completely disrupts the workflow. You stop debugging at that point. There's no reason for you to continue on. So don't modify objects that you don't own. If you want more, I wrote an entire blog post about this and how it's bitten many different people in different libraries over the years. So avoid global functions and variables. Global objects bad. When there are too many of them, you're affecting the environment that you're working in. You're poisoning it, pretty much, because you've now just staked a claim in that global namespace and nobody else can use it. And you might think that's OK, except when somebody else comes up with the same name for something different. And then life sucks a lot. So globals, no. Always attach them to some sort of top-level object. You can take the hit for one object. At Yahoo, we had the Yahoo top-level object. You just attach everything onto that. And you keep the global scope from getting polluted. Throw your own errors. So this is something that doesn't happen enough. When I was out of college and I saw throw for the first time, I thought that is the dumbest thing I've ever seen in my life. As a developer, my job is to avoid errors. Why would I cause them? Now with a few more years under my belt, it makes a lot of sense. Especially when you deal with the sort of error messages that browsers give you, like null is undefined. Oh, that's really useful. That tells me what's going on. Right, so if you're in a situation where you might get some sort of opaque error message back, then you just throw your own error. And so in this case, if the first argument is missing, there is no way in hell that this function is going to work. So in that case, I'm going to throw an error, and I'm just going to say, hey, here's the method that I'm in. Here's what you did wrong. And then you know to go and fix that. It short circuits the debugging process completely. You can just go in and figure out where to go immediately. Okay, so avoid null comparisons. Comparing something against null doesn't usually give you enough information, unless you're expecting null to be there in the first place. So in this case, I can say items is going to be an array. I can tell that because it's using sort and for each, which are only available on array objects. And I'm saying if items is not equal to null. Right, so the assumption in there is that if items is not equal to null, I can proceed. But that's a false assumption because I could pass in the number 1, and it would pass that test. And so what I really care about is if that thing is an array. So if it's an array, then I can actually move on and do what I was intending to do. So you can use a bunch of different tools. You can use instance of to figure out if something is a particular type of object. You can use type of to test for primitive types, so strings, booleans, numbers. Be careful, though, because type of null is object. And type of any other object is also object. This is a language bug that unfortunately can never be fixed at this point because it's too old. So you just have to be aware of it. Separate config data from application data. So I consider config data anything that the application uses to do its job, but may change at some point. And so here I would say UI string, URL, config data. Things that are likely to change, but the application logic needs in order to do its job. And so as a first step, I like to separate those out. I don't like having configuration information buried deep inside of application logic. Because when you have to change that, that means you have to go into application logic to change it. And that increases the likelihood that you will introduce an error in the application logic. Right? Why even go near there if you don't have to? So as a first step, you can separate things out. So what do you separate out? All URLs, for God's sakes. Do not bury URLs deep inside of your code. URLs have a nasty habit of changing. They're not as uniform as they may seem. Never put those in the middle of your code. I don't care, JavaScript, PHP, Java, I don't care. Don't put it in the middle of your code. Bad idea. Any strings that are displayed to the user. Also a really bad idea to have peppered throughout your code. Why? Because that changes a lot. So you want to separate those out as well. Any HTML that needs to be created from JavaScript. Going back to the point earlier, you don't want giant HTML strings in your JavaScript. Settings, things like items per page, permissions, anything like that, you don't want to have in the middle of your JavaScript. And even repeated unique values sometimes. So if you're using the same CSS class a bunch of different times in your JavaScript, it's worthwhile to pull that out into its own variable. Because you might have to change it at some point in time. And why bother grepping through all of the code to figure out where to do that? And basically, any value that may change in the future. So if you're writing some code and you're like, I wonder if somebody's going to change their mind about this, it's a pretty good indicator that you should separate that out. And I wrote this little tool. If you go and look at it on GitHub, it will look abandoned. But abandoned is just another word for done, because it doesn't do that much. All it does is it takes a Java properties file, which is a format I like a lot, which is just name equals value on different lines. And it converts it into a format that JavaScript can consume. So that's either just straight JSON, or assigning that JSON into an object, or like a JSON P string, something like that. Found it useful on a few projects that I've worked on. All right, last section, automation. So automation is something that not enough people do when dealing with JavaScript, but we do it in a lot of other places. Finally, there are a lot of really cool tools to help you create an awesome build process for JavaScript. And the idea is the same as any other build system, is you take a bunch of files that are useful for maintainability's sake, and then you're able to get them into a format that's really useful for deployment's sake. And so you can do things like add, remove debugging statements, concatenate files, generate documentation, validate code, test code, minify files, even deploy. Right? And so these are just a bunch of tools that help you with all of those things. So you can add, remove debugging code. JS build tools adds in like if-def, if-ndef stuff, same as in C. For generating documentation, there's JSDoc, which was like the first documentation generator for JavaScript. It uses JavaDoc API style. There's YUIDoc, which uses the same sort of style. It's just supports different types of formats. There's Doco, which is a little bit different. So the other two are API documentation generators. This is narrative documentation generation. So it takes the comments and the code and puts them side by side. So you can scroll down and get an explanation of the code right next to it. For validating code, there's JSLint, which is written by Doug Crockford. There's JSHint, which is a fork of JSLint with more configurable options. There's a YUI compressor, which was the previous gold standard for minifying files. It was the first one that would minify files in a syntax-aware way. So it will remove white space and do a couple of other nice things. But if it runs into an ambiguous situation, it will not change that code. So it's completely safe to run through, which is one of the reasons why I liked it a lot. It also shortens your variable and function names to shorter things, but only for things that are private. Uglify is the new gold standard, does horrible, awesome things to your code. Not as safe as YUI compressor, so I'm always a little bit leery when people just jump on the Uglify bandwagon, but still pretty cool. Closure Compiler from Google does a lot of horrible things as well to your code to make it very small. So you have to be a little bit careful with which flips you switch for that. For building, I've always been a fan of Ant. So it's a Java build tool, but it has a lot of things that are built in that make it really awesome for JavaScript, like concatenating files, regular expression replacement, kinds of stuff like that. This is Julian Lecomte wrote a nice blog post about how to use Ant for front-end development. The new hotness is called Grunt. It is a pure JavaScript build system built on Node.js. Still undergoing a lot of change and a lot of development, which is why I usually don't tell people to go out and start using it like right away, because it's not yet 1.0. A lot of changes that are happening, but very interesting to keep an eye on. And another URL to go read more about it. And I'll share the slides afterwards so you don't have to worry about copying down URLs. So when you have builds, it's nice to have a bunch of different types of build. Usually you go for a deployment one, a testing one, and a development one. And that just allows you to mix and match a bunch of different steps depending on what you need at that point in time. Right? And it's really helpful to have a very fast dev build. And then as you get further into the release process, you make things longer, add more checks, more tests before you finally deploy. All right, so just to recap what we're talking about, style guides are important because code is the way that we communicate with one another. Right? In the browser specifically, loose coupling of the layers, JavaScript, CSS, and HTML, is really important to make debugging easier and also maintainability. Good programming practices allow for easier debugging, and code organization and automation helps to bring some sanity to this process. And I always like to leave people with this quote. Always code as if the guy who ends up maintaining your code will be a violent psychopath who knows where you live. And if you let those be your guiding words, you'll probably be OK. So that's it. Slides. Thanks. So slides are up on my SlideShare already, slideshare.net/nzakas.